welcome. This is the Kelly's Astrology podcast, where you can find insight, guidance, and understanding through astrology. I'm Kelly, and I'll be your host. Hey there, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Kelly's Astrology podcast. Today, I want to explore some of the astrology of having a milestone birthday. As I do, what I'm hoping is that you'll be able to start to see how seemingly random ages in your life might be connected and might be maybe reactivated, or themes and topics from a time in your past might come forward to a specific milestone birthday. I personally find these threads through time to be absolutely fascinating to explore. It's something that can lead to a lot of aha moments in client sessions and for students. So I want to share just a very kind of small and hopefully accessible part of this process with you today. What looking at these threads through time can do is it can help show you how themes and topics that were important at one age in your life might echo or reappear at other specific ages. So to do this, I want to briefly share about two timing techniques, which are both ancient astrology techniques or ancient timing techniques. One of them is annual profections, and the other has to do with the minor years of the planets. And I wanted to let you know that if after today's show, you're keen to learn even more about some of these ancient timing techniques, I have a new webinar happening live on April 12th, where you can learn about timing with the minor years of the planets, and where I'll also be teaching about using the ascensional times of the signs for timing. These are super fun ways to explore timing, and they're much more accessible than you might think. If you can add or subtract, you can use these timing tools. So you can find out more about the webinar coming up on April 12th via my website, kellysastrology.com. And of course, we'll share the link in the show notes below as well. Okay, so to show you these techniques in action, I'm going to use the example of somebody turning 40. Now, before you think, I'm older than that, or 40 is still years away, you might be interested to know that turning 40 is also linked to the following ages, to 16, to 28, to 52, and to 64. So if any of those years are important or relevant to you, this example of turning 40 might resonate. As we go along, I'm going to mention a few links to different milestone ages than 40. There's an example I'll use about turning 50, and there's some info about turning 30 and 60 and 70 that I'm going to throw in, just some brief things so that you can see how energy creates resonance through time. The other piece that you might want to keep in mind as we're going here is that if you have an important planet in your chart, or you have an aspect that you know is really core to understanding your chart and your life, you will find it especially interesting to work with the minor years of the planets. And that's because working with the minor years of the planets can help you understand when a planet or even an aspect becomes especially active. So one of the kind of secret things that you can do with working with the minor years of the planets is that you can time activation of aspects in the birth chart, of the angles in the birth chart, and of important planets, or even, important planets. That's probably enough to say for now. So if you've ever wondered, this major aspect in my chart, when is it going to most affect me? Working with the minor years of the planets, bringing in a little bit of the ascensional times will show you the answer to that question. We're not going to go to that level of detail today, but just to let you know, the why that we do timing in astrology, what you can do with timing. And so now that we've kind of talked a little bit about what we might get out of timing in astrology, let's get into talking about the how and those two techniques that I mentioned, annual profections and the minor years. So I really just want to show you these techniques in action. So first up, the simplest ancient timing technique, which is annual profections, that links each age to a house in the chart. And this is an ancient timing technique that is fairly widely used today. It was one of the most widely used timing techniques in the ancient period. Now, linking an age to a house in the chart, you might be having some questions already. Of course, there are only 12 houses in the chart, so this is a repeating cyclical process. And the basic guideline here is that any birthday where your age is a multiple of 12, that's going to be bringing you back to the first house. We call that a first house year. So if you're turning 60, for instance, if you remember your times tables from school, 60 is 5 times 12. So it's a number that is a multiple of 12. And that means at the age of 60, you are having a first house year by profection, and you are experiencing the topics of the first house, focusing on yourself, your identity, your personality, your body, your health, your vitality. You're also diving deep into the characteristics and the energy of the sign on your first house, which will be your rising or ascendant sign. You'll also be you'll be especially attuned to any planets that are linked to your first house. So if you have any planets in the first house, they can be very active at the age of 60. And of course, the ruling planet of the sign on your first house will step in to the spotlight then. So if you're 60 and you're exploring these first house themes because your birthday is a multiple of 12, there is a resonance to when you were 36 and 48 and 24 and 72 and 84, because all of these ages are also multiples of 12 and they're also all first house years. So whether you realize it or not, there's a thread running through your chart and life. 24, 36, 48, 60, 72, 84. Each of those years is energetically connected. Now, I mentioned we would use 40 as our baseline here. So turning 40 is associated with the fifth house, which is arguably the most fun-focused house in the chart. The raw essence of the fifth house is about pleasure, enjoyment, relaxation. It's also about children. And so if you're 40, you can subtract or add 12 years to 40 to find these other fifth house years. So 40 is connected to 16 and 28, but also to 52 and 64 and 76. And so again, we see the thread of the energy of the fifth house running through your chart and life, activated at 40, but also at these years before and after. Now, for most people turning 40 and having a fifth house year, in theory, this would be an enjoyable and fun year. However, we know that astrology is much more nuanced than that, and your personal experience of your fifth house year at 40 or 36 or 52 and so on will be influenced by the sign that you have on the cusp of your fifth house, as well as any planets that are in your fifth house, and most importantly, by the ruling planet of the sign on your fifth house cusp. So for instance, some of you might have Sagittarius or Pisces on the fifth house, and that means that you'll have a Jupiter-themed 40th fifth house year. That might mean adventure and optimism. It might mean generosity. It might mean growth and learning and expansion. You could get a variety of those Jupiter themes. You might have more of the fiery, active Sag Jupiter fifth house experience. You might have more of the emotional, compassionate, spiritual Pisces Jupiter fifth house themes, depending on what sign you have on your fifth. Now, some of you won't have Sagittarius or Pisces on your fifth house. Maybe you have Aries or Scorpio on your fifth house, and you're going to have more of an active, competitive Mars kind of 40th celebration. And that will depend on Mars and Jupiter in your birth chart as well. So we've got the general themes of the natural significations of Jupiter or Mars that can come in, but you'll also want those natal or chart-specific factors of Jupiter or Mars or whatever planet it is that rules your fifth house sign. So there's lots of layers here. And for those of you who've been exploring astrology for a long time, you know that there is kind of increasing levels of nuance and refinement. But it's that nuance that leads to the specificity and can help you be, more attuned to the specific themes or the qualities of energy that will be coming forward into your life via your chart at different ages. So you can think about the sign on your fifth house cusp, the ruling planet of that, but also think about the condition of that planet in your chart. And all of that weaves into your experience of being 40. So just by exploring the fifth house in your chart with the sign there and the planets that might be in the fifth or ruling the fifth, you really can attune to the kind of energy and quality of experience that you will be most likely to encounter at 40. And if, like me, 40 is in the rearview mirror for you, it can be helpful to go back and understand a little bit more about why 40 was the way it was for you. So there's so much interpretive info that we are just skipping right over here because I wanted to lay down the basic structure of the technique so that you each have a starting place for this. But let me know in the comments as you're going what you're discovering about your experiences at 40 based on the fifth house in your chart. So that's the first piece of info about turning 40, that it's linked to the fifth house, and a deep dive on your fifth house will be well rewarded by you having a better understanding of what 40 might be about for you, but also remembering that that is tied to 28 and 52 as well. That 40 links to those other two times. It also links to 16 and 64. So you can see the thread, and I'd be really intrigued to hear from any of you who can really see the topics and themes of your fifth house coming up at those different ages. Now, if you're turning 50, that is a third house year, and turning 60, as we mentioned earlier, is a first house year. If you're turning 30, that's a seventh house year. And if you're turning 70, that is an 11th house year. So each of the different parts of the chart are tied to these different milestone birthdays. So if you're turning 50, and we know that's a third house year, you can then add and subtract 12 to 50 to get other third house years that would be relevant for you. So if you're turning 50, you're in your third house. 38 was your previous third house year, and 62 will be your next third house year. So just by thinking, okay, I'm 50, it's a third house year, add or subtract 12 can give you your previous or your next third house year. If 60 is a first house year, that one's kind of easy because we know if we add or subtract 12 from 60, we will get, we're back in the first house years. If you're 30, that's a seventh house year. It's all about relationships. Everyone's very interested in that. So 30 minus 12 brings us to 18. 30 plus 12 brings us to 42. 42 plus 12 brings us to 54. They are all seventh house years that are tied to your 30th. So just as a way of anchoring time and thinking about those milestone birthdays, but then thinking about those milestone birthdays and what they're bringing in that is unique to that age of life. So the second piece of info that's relevant for turning 40 comes from working with these minor years of the planets. Now, the basic premise of this concept is that each planet has a variety of years linked to it. Each planet has its minor, its mean, and its greater years. And each of these different years of the planets can be used in different ways. For our purposes today, we're going to be focusing on the minor years of the planets. Now, I'm going to dive straight in to the two planets that I want to focus on because they're tied to 40. So the minor years of the moon are 25 and the minor years of Mars are 15. So if you wanted to work with Mars or the moon individually, you would think about topics linked to your moon being activated and influential in your life around that age of 25. And that would include topics of the moon in general, but also those specific themes and topics of the moon in your chart. The house the moon is in, the house that has the moon's sign of Cancer on the cusp. So that's how you could just go straight away, moon aspect, moon themes, moon placement in my chart, 25. Similarly with Mars, you could just focus on Mars themes, the house with Mars in it, the topics of the houses with Aries and Scorpio on the cusp, and those being active around the age of 15. However, to take it a little further and personalize it more, some of you will have links between the moon and Mars. And when you have a moon-Mars link, we would add the minor years of the moon and Mars together, 25 and 15, and that brings us to 40. So if you have any moon-Mars links, and I'm going to run through what some of them might be in a moment, they also become active at 40. And so if you have an aspect from the moon to Mars, that's kind of the simplest, most direct way to think about this. If we have moon conjunct Mars, moon sextile Mars, moon square Mars, moon opposite Mars, moon trine Mars, that aspect is very strong and influencing your life around the age of 40. And we get there by adding the minor years of the two planets in that aspect. Now, some of you won't have a moon-Mars aspect. Many of you won't. It's not compulsory to have a moon-Mars aspect, but if you do, it becomes active at 40. Now, some of you will have the moon in a sign ruled by Mars. Maybe you have the moon in Aries or the moon in Scorpio. Some of you are going to have Mars in Cancer, which is the sign ruled by the moon. And all of these configurations or placements fulfill this moon-Mars criteria. And so if you don't have a moon-Mars aspect, but you have the moon and Mars in each other's signs, it doesn't have to be a reception. You can just have Mars in Cancer and the moon somewhere else, or the moon in Aries and Mars somewhere different. But if either the moon or Mars is in a sign ruled by the other planet, so if the moon is in a sign ruled by Mars or Mars is in the sign ruled by moon, that placement is active at 40 as well. And that's coming up via the sum of the minor years of the moon and Mars. Now, we do know that aspects from the moon to Mars can have some drama. Okay, so we know that aspects from the moon to Mars have a lot of heat and a lot of energy in them. So if you did have a more dramatic time around the age of 40, maybe with some major change, a bit of upheaval, or just a lot happening in a short space of time, that will be the minor years activation of those moon-Mars links becoming active. So if you have a moon-Mars aspect, that becomes active at 40. If the moon is in a sign ruled by Mars, or if Mars is in a sign ruled by the moon, that all becomes active at 40. And so one thing to keep in mind is that as we get further into doing any timing with astrology, the focus narrows so that not everybody fulfills the criteria. But if you do, everybody has 40 activating the fifth house. That's like a general thing. But if you also have some of these moon-Mars links, that's coming up at 40 as well. And so if you don't have one of these moon-Mars links, that's okay. That's just something that won't be in your experience of 40. Now, another milestone age that does have this minor years combination is 50. So at 50, what we have coming together is the minor years of Mercury with the minor years of Saturn. So the minor years of Mercury are 20 and the minor years of Saturn are 30. So we add them together for 50. And so if we jump straight in based on what we've already looked at, if you have an aspect from Mercury to Saturn in your chart, that's going to become active via the minor years at 50. And remember, at 50, you're in a third house year. So there are some communication themes there anyway. Or if you have Mercury in one of Saturn's signs, if you have Mercury in Capricorn or Aquarius, that's going to activate at 50 based on Mercury, the sum of Mercury's minor years with the minor years of its ruling planet. If you have Saturn in Gemini or in Virgo, which are signs ruled by Mercury, that is also going to bring up these Mercury-Saturn years at 50. So Mercury in a sign ruled by Saturn, Saturn in a sign ruled by Mercury. So everyone with Saturn in Gemini or Saturn in Virgo, those generations, that placement becomes active at 50. And for those of you that have an aspect from Mercury to Saturn, that becomes active at 50. And so if you, so you can really think about this combination of planets coming up at a certain milestone. Now, there are lots of aspects and lots of ages that are important according to the minor years of the planets, but they're not necessarily tied to these milestone birthdays. So just as a way of kind of grounding and organizing our time together today, I did want to focus on those milestone birthdays. But of course, when we get into the webinar and we're looking at the minor years of the planets, we'll cover off a lot more of the active ages there. So this is just a very brief sort of taster example of how we can draw on some of these themes to do with the chart and to do with timing to give you a guide as to what some of these milestone years might be about. 40 is connected to the fifth house, so we've got fun and pleasure and enjoyment, but we do want to think about our personal fifth house and what kind of vibe that has. And then at 40, we also know Moon-Mars combinations become available. If we're thinking about 50, we know that's a third house year, and we know it's got this Mercury-Saturn combination as well. So there are so many ways, of course, that you can draw on timing and cycles and do forecasting in astrology. I hope you find these brief tips on timing with ancient astrology insightful. And if you do want to learn more about timing with the minor years or about working with the ascensional times of the signs, I hope to see you in my webinar on April 12th. Let me know in the comments below how this is resonating for you. Until next time, everyone, have a great week.